So it's my great pleasure, first of all, to thank Layla for her participation today in the launch of our booklet, but also for her participation in the conference itself last May. Really, Layla, we are very grateful to you for your work and for your continued interest in our issues that we work on, and we look forward to hearing what you have to say. It's going to be an important year, not only because it is the 75th anniversary of Israel's independence and of the Nakba, but also because of the nature of the new Israeli government. I don't need to describe the character of this government. It describes itself in its own coalition agreement and in the statements that ministers have made. And I think it's fair to say that, to put it mildly, the positions that this new government is going to take, particularly towards the Palestinian issue, but also on issues domestically inside Israel, is going to be something of a challenge, if not a headache, to many governments around the world, including in the United Kingdom. So I think that we have quite an important year coming up. It's also going to be a year in which, for Palestinian politics, growing uncertainty over President Abbas's future and what the consequences might be of his departure from the scene. He is getting old, and I think that many will anticipate that at some stage he may leave the political scene, either for health reasons or for political reasons. And there are unfortunately quite a lot of concerns that the transition to his successor may not go as smoothly as we would wish, and that there could be further internal violence inside Palestine itself related to the succession. There is the unresolved issue of the divisions between Gaza and the West Bank, between Hamas and Fatah. Although the Algerians had mediated an accord between them, I'm afraid it seems to be, that particular accord seems to be going the way that several other previous agreements have done, mediated by the Egyptians and others, and being honored more in the breach than in the observance. But we could hold out hopes that perhaps if there is some foreign pressures that are put onto the Palestinian authorities, that we might see a renewal of Palestinian democracy. Elections, as everyone knows, are long overdue. They were postponed by President Abbas a couple of years ago under the argument that East Jerusalemites could not participate. But many people think that that was possibly not the real reason why they were postponed. But certainly it ought to be the case that all of us who live in democracies and who care for democracies, as Palestinians passionately do, would like to see a renewal of Palestinian democratic legitimacy. As far as the British government is concerned, I'm not sure that it is going to be putting this particular issue at the top of the agenda. The British government has supported the Abraham Accords, which have so far had little to say about the Palestinian issue. And I think that any hopes that we might have had that those accords, the establishment of formal diplomatic relations with 4 Arab states, would lead to a change in policies towards Palestinians, have so far at least been disappointed by it. The 75th anniversary year, and because of the legal challenges that are now coming up, we're going to see that some attention, international attention, will be required whether governments wish it or not. And I'm thinking in particular of actions that have been taken by the International Criminal Court, its commission of inquiry into human rights abuses committed by all parties, I should add, in the occupied territories. Israel has been refusing to cooperate with that particular commission of inquiry. And more recently than that, something which is potentially of considerable significance, and that is the referral by the UN General Assembly of the legal status of the occupation, and it's quite a broad referral, to the International Court of Justice, the World Court at The Hague. So that case being heard by the world is going to be an important one. It was more than 20 years ago that the ICJ gave an advisory opinion on the wall that Israel built in the West Bank, And I think that unfortunately, the new advisory opinion is going to be equally significant. I'm afraid people are noticing that my sound is cutting in and out. I do have a recording, I do have a problem with my microphone, and I hope that it's going to come back again. Perhaps better, because of my sound problems, that I hand over now to John to have a discussion with Layla about the issues that came up during our conference. John, over to you.
Thank you very much, Andrew. This event this evening is to launch the booklet containing the proceedings of the conference, and I commend it to you all. Why did we decide to have a conference entitled Britain's Abandoning Palestine? For the very simple reason that Britain failed its sacred trust of civilization towards the Palestinian people, an obligation that was a legal obligation under Article 22 of the Covenant of the League of Nations. Instead of the well-being, development and independence which Britain was obliged to ensure for Palestine, it left the Palestinian people in a legal vacuum with chaos, war and dispossession. It carries direct responsibility for this disaster, but that responsibility is too little remembered in Britain today. In fact, it would be no exaggeration to say this is a case of amnesia. Maybe we might call it an imperial amnesia, I don't know. In August, 3 months after our conference, Channel 4 had an excellent documentary on the amnesia about the partition of India. I very much hope something similar will be done by the BBC or Channel 4 or another station that will set out the facts so that people can know what actually happened. It is Britain's duty to acknowledge its responsibility, our British responsibility, and to work now to advance equal rights for all in what was once the mandate of Palestine. These rights include self-determination and mutual security, and it is clear today who has self-determination and security and who does not. In a moment, I'm going to start my conversation with Layla, but just before doing that, I'm going to tell you a few highlights from the conference. Ghada Karmi, who was an eyewitness at the age of 6, she was ethnically cleansed from West Jerusalem. And she, as a 6-year-old, first realized there was trouble when one morning in January 1948, on Britain's watch, while Britain was still the mandatory power, she suddenly thought that day had come in the middle of the night. And what it was the fire from the Semiramis Hotel that had been blown up by the Haganah. So that was a child's introduction. I recommend reading Ghada's account because it is a very moving document indeed. Our keynote speaker was Hanan Ashrawi, and one of the things she focused on was the fact that we want all the rules of international law to be applied when it comes to Ukraine, but we forget about Palestine. And there is another little similar, and when one sees the attitude of President Putin, it very often reminds me of the attitudes of the Israeli right wing. I'm afraid what one might say, the mainstream in the Knesset at the moment, towards Palestine. And don't forget, Putin denies that the Ukrainians are a people. What does that remind you of? Another thing that happened during the conference was that we had a very good presentation from the UN Human Rights Rapporteur, Michael Link. And he showed the connection between Britain's role in Palestine and what happens today, a direct connection. This takes the form of the British Emergency Defence Regulations, which allowed for all kinds of unspeakable policies to be conducted without the rule of law. Deportations, collective punishments, house demolitions, and so on and so on. And they are now enshrined, they are reenacted, codified, and updated in the 2016 Israeli security law. Towards the end of the conference, we also had an excellent panel of Palestinians, and they talked about the difficulty of being a Palestinian and what it means to be a Palestinian. And one of the most moving things was said by Adam Abdallah, a member of the panel, who I think spoke for all of them when he said, in the UK, you're very welcome to be Palestinian as long as you don't overstep certain red lines, which is not to be actively and politically engaged and not to act upon this identity that you have. And how do you act upon this identity? By seeking justice, as Andrew has put it, and the Balfour Project puts it, equal rights for all. There was also a very moving talk by Layla, who I'm about to speak to in a minute, in which she talked about her own family and their personal experience, and how about the fact that she is the first Palestinian MP that we know of, first MP in the Westminster Parliament of Palestinian heritage that we know of. And ironically, because she is the MP for West Oxford and Abingdon, she is the MP for Jericho, which those of you who don't know Oxford may remember from Inspector Morse. Of course, there's another Jericho, and I think some of her family still live there today, enduring the occupation. And she said something very interesting in the session with parliamentarians after that, in which she said, every year I introduce another bill for the recognition of Palestine. And I particularly want to impress on this government to not forget their historic obligation to my family, to the people of Palestine in the Balfour Declaration that said it was a land that was for two peoples. It is often forgotten that the Balfour Declaration also said that the rights of the Palestinians should be maintained. And as I pointed out in my own talk at that conference, that included their political rights. But now, Layla, if we can begin to talk, could I begin by asking you, are you going to introduce another bill this year?
It's already been introduced, and it's going to be debated on March the 17th. I was quick on St. Patrick's Day, indeed. You know, and make the comparisons as you will. But we actually were quite quick draw, and I think I may even get time to debate it this year, which I'm quite excited at the prospect of. So we've been preparing for that. We're really looking forward to it. And as I said, the purpose of the bill is to set a drumbeat reminder. I mean, Parliament has debated this before. It's voted on it before. Parliament's will is settled when it comes to Palestine. Parliament wants to recognise Palestine. But I think it's incredibly important to keep that pressure up and to make sure that it isn't gone from the table for those historic obligations. But I have to say, you know, you look across, and thank you so much, Andrew, for your sort of summary of a little bit of where we are now in the region. I mean, it's dire. And I speak very often, when I speak about this in the House, I think, well, frankly, there are people more learned than I. There are historians. I'm a science teacher. You know, what do I know? All I can bring is my family's experience, my heart, my identity. And I would, I think, disagree with the speaker who said that, you know, we're fine as Palestinians so long as we don't act on that identity. I think actually you can and you must and you should, because actually there are an incredible number of British Palestinians, second, sometimes third generation, but we feel Palestinian too. It is our heritage too. And I am despairing of the idea that we abandon it. So I thank you the Balfour Project for continuing to make the case for why the British government needs to simply do what it said it was going to do, to continue to raise the plight of Palestinians on the ground and to continue to advocate. And thank you for having that wonderful conference and for inviting me here today. It's a real pleasure.
Not at all. But surely, don't you think that many politicians, journalists and public figures are scared of talking honestly about the injustices in Palestine today?
Yes, bluntly, yes. And so am I, actually, John, to an extent. And I'll tell you why. Because I get abuse from all sides. My words get twisted. They take things I say, paraphrase them into something that I never actually said, make implications about my positions. I've been called not Palestinian enough because I'm only half Palestinian. I am told that I should just sort of stay in my lane and not talk about it at all. I am called an anti-Semite for talking about it, full stop. And then I am also told that I'm anti-Palestinian because I stand up for the rights of Israelis too, and the Jewish community in the UK. And the thing is, and what I've tried to demonstrate, is that you can and you must talk about it. I try and pick my words incredibly carefully. And by picking your words carefully, by not playing on their ground, by not falling into the tropes that they choose and the traps that they put, that actually you can have a robust discussion about the injustices, the human rights abuses, the situation on the ground, the flagrant, brazen way that the Israeli government, especially now, is flouting international law. And you can say all of those things whilst maintaining that very, very important line of, not offending the Jewish population in the UK. And it's entirely possible to do and important to do. But yes, are they scared? Certainly. And when I speak to colleagues of mine who are incredibly sympathetic, and behind the scenes, they will say, oh, thank God you're here and thank you for saying things. And, but they are scared to do it because of what they're going to get on Twitter, what they're going to get in their emails, what they're going to get in their inbox. And I think one of the things that we can all do to help the situation is to encourage MPs to speak out, but also perhaps if, someone does say something, to not attack too quickly, to maybe encourage them to talk about it differently, to perhaps give them something easier to talk about, rather than go straight for very, very difficult issues that especially the Israeli government like to put as very divisive, apartheid being the probably most prominent recent example. There are other subjects that are much easier to talk about, child detention, for example, that I try and bring also to the fore in the House to help parliamentarians develop that language, develop that knowledge that gives them confidence to be able to talk about the much more difficult issues as well. And it's just so easy with everything else that comes into your inbox, from potholes to latest council matters to what's happening in Myanmar and everywhere else. There's so much that comes into an MP's inbox. I don't blame MPs for putting this necessarily on the too complicated, too difficult pile. We do that with a lot of topics, but we can make it easier for them to perhaps dust it off every so often. And if they feel confident about it, and if they feel passionately about it, as many do when they know the facts, then that helps them to be able to speak out.
I am convinced that the silent majority in this country is very firmly, of the kind of, has exactly the kind of views you have just expressed. And I think it's very important that, very often when saying something, there's an adage I'm very fond of: less is more. You mentioned the use of the term apartheid. It seems to me, though, one also has to call a spade, and I don't see how one can get away from the conclusion that in the territories occupied in 1967, apart from the Sinai Peninsula, which was returned to Egypt, Israel does commit the war crime of apartheid.
Yeah, and I think that those who, what we have to appreciate, and I was really struck by this, and actually I've been recently both to Israel, but also to the occupied territories and to Palestine. And you mentioned Jericho. I mean, it was very moving because it was the first time I'd spent any time in Jericho afterwards. And I went to the Mount of Temptation, was where my grandfather went as a child to hide. So in 48, the bombings happened. It was too dangerous. The family up sticks from Jerusalem and went to the Mount of Temptation. They're Greek Orthodox, so they knew people there and they were able to shelter there. And he wrote his memoirs too. My great grandfather did, Wasif Shahariya, and in his footsteps, my grandfather did before he passed away. And in his book, he says, well, I entered that monastery as a Palestinian and I left as a refugee because the assumption was that, you know, they would come and sort of save the day. But I'm just incredibly concerned that, you know, you talk about language and specificity. You know, you've got to call a spade, but you also have to appreciate that most people just don't have a clue. And I had a Shabbat dinner with an Israeli family, and it was lovely. And they were from North London. They'd done Aliyah 15 years ago. He was an accountant. She now spent her time writing children's books about food banks. You know, clearly very socially minded people and lovely, lovely family. And when I asked them, you know, what's your experience of Palestine? What do you understand about the Palestinian situation? I have to say, even living there, their understanding of the reality on the ground for Palestinians, literally living miles away, was shockingly poor. And then you could apply that to someone who lives in the UK just as well. So yes, call a spade, but also appreciate that you've got to bring people from where they are to where you want them to be. And you have to understand that so many people just don't have basic facts, excuse the cat, it's basic facts about the situation on the ground in Palestine right now. The conclusion I was left with from the 2 weeks that I spent, 1 week with Lib Dem Friends of Israel and 1 week with Kabu, very much seeing all sides, speaking to all people. It was very difficult for me, I have to say. Speaking to some of the people on the Israeli side, I found it quite traumatizing, frankly. But the overarching sense that I had was that many people here are sort of stuck in the Palestine of the 90s. And they haven't appreciated how things have moved on since then, how much worse it has got, how much more difficult it is. And that worries me. And so whenever we talk about difficult things, always remember the audience you're talking to. Most people, and I'm sure it doesn't apply to the people watching today or speaking today, because we are all very interested and very knowledgeable and have a passion and an interest. But when we're trying to make the case, an active case to bring new people on to want to help this situation, this god-awful, dire situation, then we have to start where they are.
I think that's got to be right. You've quite recently you've been to Jerusalem, haven't you?
We went so to Jerusalem. We also went, so with Friends of Israel, went to Tel Aviv and spoke to various people. This was before the election in Israeli politics. I wanted to understand what is the context in which a lot of these decisions are made. They are the occupying force. It's important I understand their psyche. It was fascinating. And then I spent a week there with Medical Aid for Palestinians and Kabu. And there, of course, you know, we did Hebron. We went to a military court. We saw children being tried for throwing stones. It was incredibly moving and heart-rending. You know, we went to the hospital with children, babies, neonatal units, where one child had come in, was born prematurely, had got well, but there was no permit issued from Gaza for the parents to be able to come and get the child. So a baby, literally days old, 3 weeks old, no parents for the sake of a visa or a permit. I mean, it was heart-wrenching. I cried in the hospital. It's inhumane. It's completely inhumane. But most people wouldn't have a clue. And it has to be seen to be believed, but it also has to be spoken about to be believed. And I think people, when, you know, they see, and I even approach those, you know, on the conservative benches who actively make the case in a pro-Israeli way, and that, you know, this is making it up. I'd like to start, and I always try and think the best of people. You know, what do they actually know about this? What have they been told and by who? And what do they actually know of the real situation for Palestinians on the ground? And it's fair enough if they've gone and they've seen it and they still have those views, and I can robustly debate with them, and I think I'd win. But it's a completely different situation if they've never been, if all they're getting are briefings from the Israeli embassy and that completely black and white counter narrative, which is often put out. Frankly, some of it is just mis and disinformation. And you have to understand that the people saying this stuff, they themselves aren't bad people. They're just getting wrong information. And as soon as we lose the humanity from the situation, as soon as we entrench ourselves in the one side or other, we lose the ability to bring people with us. And so that's what I always try and do. So we've got the debate on Palestine statehood on the 17th. I think it's an important time to reflect in the House on this new government, what it has said. You know, it's not just about supporting Palestine. And I think this is the point that is one of the most important points to make. If you believe in the international rule of law, and if you believe in human rights, then you have no choice but to stand up for the rights of Palestinians and to challenge what is going on the ground. You can do that and at the same time have enormous sympathy from all sides. And it's a dire situation for Israeli citizens who don't want any part in this. My heart goes out to those people in Tel Aviv who I met, who are looking at this government, who desperately also want a two-state solution and thinking to themselves, where is this country going? Further and further to the right, further and further towards authoritarianism, despite it saying that it's, you know, the only democracy in the Middle East. You know, I really feel for them. And so we have to make that distinction. We have to understand that there are many more allies than we might ever imagine in our cause for two states and peace. And our job, my job, in my view, is to find them, nurture them, bring them towards something that they can believe in, and try and keep that flame alive. And it's not just me doing it. There are many, many parliamentarians who, as I say, are more erudite than I and who have studied it and are long in the tooth politically on it. And I think what I try and do is bring, you know, that personal experience, that family experience I have, just to give that color, that flavor, that depth, and that history.
I was
Layla, our
disturbed.
time with you.
Sorry.
Forgive me speaking over you, John. I was going to say to Layla, our time with her is short tonight, unfortunately, and we need to allow some time for audience's questions also. But I'd like to ask Layla a very quick question first, and I hope it doesn't require a long answer, which is, what do you think are the prospects of breaking down the rather entrenched partisanship that has developed, the rather knee-jerk partisanship on both sides? Do you feel that there is grounds for being able to get that silent middle ground that John spoke about, to be able to have the honest debate about the facts and appeal to British people's sense of fair play and common sense? Yes,
I do. I absolutely do. I don't think I'd be here if I was totally devoid of hope. In fact, I'm a generally glass half full kind of person. But I'll relay a conversation that I had with, and I won't say who, but it was a prominent pro-Israeli conservative politician who, if people watch these debates, they'd recognize them, as they are often on the bench refuting what's coming from the opposition benches. And it does seem to be, you know, primarily, not always, the conservative side that is the pro-Israel side, and it's the opposition benches who tend to be, but not exclusively at all, the pro-Palestinian side. And we were sitting over a drink, and I was talking about my family's experiences, background, and the trips that I was taking, and trying to get them to understand. And they were genuinely fascinated and interested. They had no clue that Palestinians, for example, were in Jerusalem and thriving before 48. They had no idea that Palestinians, not really. I mean, it was, they're so focused on Israel now that they hadn't really considered what Jerusalem was like before. And so when I was talking about the stories that my great-grandfather told of what Jerusalem was before 48, and how, you know, Jews and Arabs lived side by side and went to each other's houses and celebrated each other's festivals and loved each other. And actually, how that has eroded over time. And actually what we need to do is to rediscover a kindred spirit that we've lost. His frame totally shifted, and we are going to meet again, and we're going to continue to talk. He had no idea. So yes, I have hope, but we can't get to everyone to sort of individually. But that's what I mean by bringing that history, bringing that humanity, and actually not assuming that people know that people on that side understand it completely. And when they're in the pressure of a public space, maybe they too don't feel confident talking about it. And we have to help them. We have to not dismiss that their minds are changeable. And if he could shift his position, perhaps even just privately, slightly, then yes, that silent middle ground who don't feel confident about it, I'm confident that, we talk about it more, we give them those tools, we give them the language, and they'll be able to talk about it.
Well, thank you. I think you put that very well indeed. And as you know, the educational role of helping to disabuse a lot of the ignorance that you referred to is an important part of the Balfour Project's work. It's something within our modest means we really do try to put some effort into. But I wonder, it's my last question to you, Layla, before we open up to our questions from the audience. What do you think that we as the Balfour Project should be focusing on in the coming year? Because we're not a debating society at the end of the day. We are concerned about trying to promote change. It's not an easy political environment in the UK for reasons we don't need to get into now. But would there be certain issues that you think that would be important for us to try to highlight? Would it be international, for example?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's how long is a piece of string with this issue? I think there are two that come immediately to mind. First is the makeup of the current Israeli government. As I have to say, I am scared. I am scared for what's going to happen on the ground. A situation that's already incredibly difficult is clearly going to be made worse. Netanyahu seems to be capitulating all over the place, certainly until what he wants to do with the judiciary is done. He's going to keep making concessions, and I don't know what that's going to mean. But I know that, last year was the year where the largest number of Palestinians in a very long time have been killed by Israeli Defense Forces, and I fear for the lives of all Palestinians there, but especially children who are also being caught in that crossfire. I fear for the human rights defenders that are out there. I fear for Palestinian civil society that's being proactively eroded at the moment. And I think this is such an important year because I think all of those issues, which, by the way, were not under this government, but are going to potentially be accelerated actively, proactively, brazenly by this government. So I think we need to make people aware that if you thought Bibi was bad, look what we've got now. And I think it's very easy for us to do that. I mean, the Board of Deputies, when Smotrich came to the UK, refused to meet with him. We suddenly, our enemy's enemy, if you like, and actually I wouldn't even call them that. That's poor phrasing, and I'll take that back, because we absolutely have to find allies. And what these Smotrich and Ben Gvir and what they stand for is fundamentally un-British. It's fundamentally unacceptable to so many people that actually we may find ourselves finding common ground with people we may not have thought we could have found common ground before. And when you find just a corner of common ground, that friendship can grow from there. And I think that's a good thing. So I think that could be one. The second, I think, is the 75 years, but it's independence for Israel, but it's Nakba for the Palestinians. Official recognition of the Nakba by the government, I think, would be an incredible step forward. And I will be certainly making the case for that this year. But I would also caution against feeding the photographic black and white narratives. The one thing that was good for Israel is the thing that is terrible for Palestine and vice versa. It's often true, and it's hard to get away from. But it is also, that's a very divisive way of looking at the history. And if there is a way of presenting those facts and say, well, yes, it's true that, Israel is happy that it's celebrating 75 years. We understand Rishi Sunak is going to go out there. But I think at the same time, it's equally important that we pressure Rishi Sunak to make an equally in-depth trip to the occupied territories, to Gaza, to see with his own eyes what is happening and what has happened in those 75 years. And to remind him that actually this is a direct consequence of the ambiguity in the Balfour Declaration about political rights for Palestinians, and that is currently being so eroded with the settlements and everything else, that if he genuinely believes in two states, he needs to be confronted with that. And if we can try and remind people that it didn't used to be this way, that this divisiveness, as awful as it is, it wasn't always this way, and therefore it doesn't have to be this way always. I urge people to try to just weave some of that in, because the entrenchment, in my view, there's enough of that going on in Israeli and Palestinian society. There's enough of that that's happening anyway in British politics. I would just urge, you can stand up for and speak out on what's happening, but also just add that element of hope, add the element of history, challenge the fact that, for one people to be happy, the other has to be oppressed. It doesn't have to be that way. And I will end on a very, I hope, positive note. I did come across a number of prominent Israelis who are actively calling for example, the Nakba to be taught in Israeli schools, so that education can happen on the ground there, and that young people learn that, okay, for us it's independence, but for them it means something else. And with that understanding, maybe will come compassion, and maybe will come at least a better sense of why the present looks as it does, and why we need to be striving for better.
I couldn't agree with you more, Layla, and certainly pressing for the British government, headed by a man of Indian origin, for him to be even-handed in this particular conflict, to be able to go and speak to both peoples, recognizing that there are two peoples, almost exactly the same numbers, sharing the land, but in very different situations of power and of economic and personal circumstances, lacks of personal freedom on the one side, would be so terribly important, for them to be able to do that. So I very much hope that that happens, and it's something for us all to try to campaign for. Now, time is really running out, so I'm going to ask Diana if she could to try to select a couple of questions. There have been so many interesting questions and comments coming in. We're not going to be able to do justice to them. But could you do the difficult job of trying to pick a couple?
Yeah, so luckily you have covered a lot of the themes of the questions that have come up, such as topics and themes to focus on when contacting your MP and so forth, sort of easier intros into the debate, and also the fear of being labeled as anti-Semitic, apartheid, all of those has come up in the question. So, but you did cover them, so I'm going to skip those. Lots of positive comments. I would like to say that we will be sharing the chat box with Layla after the fact, so please do post any comments and questions in there you have for her, and so I will share them with her afterwards, because we have time for literally one question. I've got a really good question from Diane Cox in Yorkshire, and she says, and we hear this a lot from our supporters, which is why I picked up on this: my MP ignores all my communication about Palestine. How else can I have a voice in Parliament?
Yeah, it's tough. And MPs do their correspondence differently. It might not just be you, and it might not just be about Palestine. I don't know. In terms of your voice in Parliament, I mean, I always suggest to people, if they're so minded, join a political party that you feel represents your views. And, if you've got the ability to feed in that way, that's great. But I would say also don't give up on your MP necessarily. It may be that, you just haven't found that topic that really sparks them. Do they have an interest that's domestic that you can link to it? A good example, as I said, child detention is just so obviously wrong. and an easier in, perhaps, than some other things that you might contact them about. So don't give up totally. But no, it is very difficult. And this is why the Balfour Project is so important. This is why the Kabu that I went out with to Palestine with is so important. You know, these campaigns in the UK. And I think one of the most important things that we as a civil society in the UK can do is to continue to foster and support these organizations who are, you know, trying to help develop that narrative and that confidence and do that educational piece. There aren't enough of them. And certainly if you know, if you were to weigh it in terms of, you know, money and resource going into one narrative versus the other, this one certainly needs more resource. So I'm sure no one here will say don't do this, but you know, if you want to support Balfour and the Balfour Project, and if you want to support any of the others, I'm sure they'd be very grateful for whatever support you can give. And again, just thank you for being here, because it shows the strength of feeling out there and the amount of support that there is for everything that they talk about.
Thank you so much for that. I have a question from Ramsey from Brussels. What this, I suppose, is mainly to John and Andrew, but it'd be really interesting to hear what Layla thinks we can do with this. What effect do you hope this souvenir booklet could have? How should we use it to our best?
Maybe I should try to answer that. I hope, first of all, that it's going to be a place of record. It's important that the record is out there for people who weren't able to follow the conference, and to be able to help to educate people about the facts that were spoken about. But I think it's also a reminder to people of the way in which we as the Balfour Project can use a document like this, following on a successful conference. And each of our annual conferences, I think, have been able to make some impression on those who were able to follow it at the time, that this is a continual process.
Yes, this particular conference.
Next year, next May.
This particular conference was about Britain abandoning Palestine and Britain's historic responsibility. And that is something so many people are quite unaware of. There's a lot of sympathy for the Palestinians, a lot of feeling for them, a lot of identification with them among the silent majority, as I mentioned. But to realize that Britain was the great power that initiated this mess that we see today is something that people should realize. And that is what the brochure is aimed at educating people about. Sorry, Layla, I cut in on you, I think.
No, you didn't at all. No, no.
Okay.
And I think all those points are really important. I think the thing about sort of the booklet in physical form, and you know, that point that it is a record, it is something to refer to. I think it's a really pivotal moment, both in the future of Palestine, but also an important moment for this country too. And it comes in the context of us having a reckoning with our colonial past. And we have a colonial past that we need to reckon with in that region too, although it gets quite often not spoken about. I will say, though, there is, again, huge sympathy when I speak to proponents of the Black curriculum, for example, that actually Palestine and what happened in Palestine is included in those conversations, because fundamentally what it is, you know, Britain, for all sorts of geopolitical reasons in the past, causing a mess somewhere, saying goodbye, walking away, and then hoping that no one notices that it was them that caused it. I dare say that you know, we still have a role to play in the region by recognizing Palestine, which is, you know, what, as I've mentioned earlier, one of my main focuses in Parliament, and also the focus of the Balfour Project. That would be huge. Britain recognizing Palestine would be huge, way more significant than when the Swedes did it. And we can assume that, you know, with the right diplomatic and political will behind it, with enough parliamentarians making the case for it, that actually we would be the first in a domino effect of a number of countries that would. And actually that would probably kickstart a peace process. People talk about, you know, what significance would it make? I mean, I talk about, in terms of my identity, in terms of the importance of reigniting hope. It is a hopeless conflict very often, getting even more hopeless, and actually recognizing Palestine would just mean so much to people on the ground trying to have that fight. But actually, I think it would also yield very positive results when it comes to people talk about getting round a negotiating table. Well, there is no table, but perhaps we can start to whittle one together again. And I think this would be an important first step.
Giving ground for hope is really a great note to end on, Layla. I'd like to give a very short advertisement for our upcoming conference, which is going to be on the 17th of May. It's a Thursday. And no, it's a Wednesday. I'm sorry, I'm making a mistake about it. But anyway, it's going to be on upholding basic human rights. And so human rights for all, Israelis and Palestinians, and what is being done or not being done to be able to uphold those rights. So I'm going to close by thanking you again, Layla, for your time and for
having me.
Thank all our audience for all their great questions and their support also. So really much appreciated.
Goodbye, everyone.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, everyone.